Derek Manning walked into the small diner on Tuesday morning like he owned the place, and in some ways he felt like he did because he had been coming here for 15 years wearing his police uniform and badge that gave him a sense of power over everyone around him. The morning sun came through the windows and lit up the old booths, and the smell of coffee and bacon filled the air, but Derek barely noticed any of it because his attention went straight to the woman sitting alone in the corner booth. She was a black woman in her early 30s with her hair pulled back, and she wore simple jeans and a gray hoodie, and she was looking down at some kind of tablet device while drinking tea from a white cup. Derek felt something twist in his gut when he saw her, sitting there so calm and quiet like she belonged in this neighborhood, and he decided right then that he did not like her being there. He walked over to her booth without being invited and slid into the seat across from her before she could say anything. The woman looked up at him with dark brown eyes that seemed to see right through him, and he did not like that either. She had a face that showed no fear and no nervousness, and that bothered Derek because he was used to people reacting to his uniform and his presence. He waited for her to look away or to show some sign of respect, but she just held his gaze for a moment and then looked back down at her tablet like he was not worth her time. Derek cleared his throat and asked her what she was doing in this neighborhood, and his voice came out harder than he meant it to, but he did not care. The woman did not look up when she answered, and she said simply that she lived here, and her voice was calm and steady. Derek laughed, but there was no humor in it, and he said he found that hard to believe because people like her did not usually live in neighborhoods like this, and he put extra weight on the words, people like her, so she would know exactly what he meant. The woman finally looked up again, and this time Derek saw something in her eyes that made him uncomfortable, but he could not name what it was. She told him quietly that she was working and would appreciate some privacy, but Derek was not about to let some woman tell him what to do, especially not in a public place, where he had every right to sit wherever he wanted. He ordered coffee from the waitress, who looked nervous and kept glancing between Derek and the woman, like she knew something bad was about to happen. Derek drank his coffee loud and watched the woman over the rim of his cup, and he made comments about how suspicious it was for someone to be sitting alone in a diner doing work on a tablet, and how in his experience people who acted like that were usually up to no good. The woman did not respond to any of his comments, and she just kept working on her tablet, and her fingers moved across the screen with quick, precise movements that showed she knew exactly what she was doing. This made Derek even angrier because he felt like she was ignoring him on purpose and treating him like he did not matter. Other people in the diner started to notice what was happening, and Derek could feel their eyes on him, but he did not care because he was a police officer, and he had authority, and no one was going to question him. He leaned forward and asked the woman again what she was really doing here, and he suggested that maybe she should find somewhere else to do her work, somewhere more appropriate for someone like her. The woman stopped typing and looked at him with those calm eyes, and she said very clearly that she had every right to be here and that she was not going to leave just because he was uncomfortable with her presence. Something in Derek snapped when she said that, because no one talked to him that way and got away with it. He felt his face get hot and his hand gripped his coffee cup tighter, and he could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. The woman went back to her tablet one more time, and Derek made a decision that would change everything. He lifted his coffee cup, and with a quick motion that he would later claim was an accident, he tipped it forward and sent the hot, dark liquid splashing across the table onto the woman's tablet and into her lap. The woman stood up fast, and coffee dripped from her clothes, and her tablet and the whole diner went completely silent. She looked down at the damage and then looked at Derek with an expression that he would remember for the rest of his life. It was not anger exactly, and it was not fear, but something else, something like disappointment mixed with pity. She picked up her tablet carefully, even though it was clearly damaged, and she wiped the coffee off as best she could with napkins from the table. Derek sat back with a small smile on his face, and he said the word oops, but everyone in the diner could hear that he did not mean it. The woman gathered her things slowly and with dignity, and before she left, she looked at Derek one last time and said something that stuck in his mind even though he tried to forget it. She said very quietly that he had no idea what he had just done, and that this was not a threat but just a simple fact. Derek laughed and asked if she was threatening a police officer, and his hand moved toward his belt where his weapon sat. But the woman just shook her head slowly like she was sad about something he could not understand. She walked out of the diner with her head up and her back straight, and Derek watched her go, feeling satisfied with himself. The other people in the diner slowly went back to their meals, but Derek noticed that some of them were looking at him differently now, and the waitress took a long time to come back and refill his coffee. He stayed and finished his breakfast and paid his bill and left a small tip, and then he went back to his patrol car feeling like he had done something important, even though he could not quite explain what that something was or why it had felt so necessary to do it. 3 days passed, and Derek tried not to think about the woman in the diner, but sometimes her face would pop into his mind when he was driving his patrol car or sitting at his desk doing paperwork. He told himself that what happened was not a big deal, and that she probably forgot about it already because people always made a fuss about nothing these days and then moved on with their lives. Derek went about his normal routine, and he stopped other drivers for minor violations, and he walked through neighborhoods looking for anything suspicious, and he felt like everything was normal until Thursday morning when his sergeant called him into the office. The sergeant was a man named Paul Griffin who had been with the department for 25 years, and he had a reputation for being fair but also for not taking any nonsense from anyone. When Derek walked into the office, he saw that Paul looked more serious than usual, and there was a folder sitting on the desk between them. Paul told Derek to close the door and sit down, and Derek felt his stomach tighten because he knew that tone and it meant trouble. Paul opened the folder and pulled out several papers, and he asked Derek if he remembered an incident at a diner 3 days ago. Derek felt his mouth go dry, but he tried to play it cool, and he said sure he remembered having breakfast there, but nothing special happened. Paul looked at him for a long moment, and then he said that was not what the witnesses said, and that multiple people had filed complaints about Derek's behavior toward a woman who had been sitting alone, minding her own business. Derek started to defend himself, and he said it was just a misunderstanding, and that his coffee had spilled by accident, but Paul held up his hand to stop him. Paul said that the diner had security cameras, and that the footage showed clearly that Derek had deliberately thrown coffee on the woman after making what appeared to be hostile and racist comments. Derek felt sweat start to form on his forehead, and he tried to explain, but the words came out wrong and jumbled. Paul sat back in his chair and looked at Derek with disappointment, and he said that Chief Gregory Palmer wanted to see Derek immediately, and that this was much bigger than a simple complaint. Derek asked what that meant, and Paul just shook his head and told him to go upstairs to the chief's office right away. Derek stood on shaky legs and walked out of the sergeant's office and made his way through the building to the top floor, where the chief had his office. The chief's secretary told Derek to go right in, and when he opened the door, he saw Chief Palmer sitting behind a large wooden desk with his hands folded in front of him. The chief was in his 50s with gray hair and hard eyes that had seen everything during his long career. He gestured for Derek to sit, and Derek sank into the chair feeling like a child about to be punished by his father. Chief Palmer did not waste time with small talk, and he asked Derek directly if he knew who the woman from the diner was. Derek said he did not know and that she never told him her name. The chief nodded slowly, and then he opened a different folder and pulled out a photograph. It was a professional photo of the woman from the diner, but in this picture she was wearing a suit and standing in what looked like a laboratory with complex equipment behind her. The chief said her name was Dr. Keisha Brooks, and she was the head of the Quantum Propulsion Division at the Henderson Space Research Facility. Derek felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. The chief continued and said that Dr. Brooks held 3 different doctoral degrees in physics and aerospace engineering and mathematics, and that she had been working on classified government projects for 8 years. Derek could not speak, and his throat felt like it was closing up. But the chief was not done, and he leaned forward and said that something extraordinary had happened 2 days after Derek threw coffee on Dr. Brooks. The chief explained that an advanced alien civilization had made first contact with Earth, and that they had been watching humanity for a long time, studying us and trying to decide if we were ready to join a larger community of intelligent species in the galaxy. Derek thought the chief must be joking, but the man's face was completely serious. The chief explained that these aliens called themselves the Viridian Collective, and they had chosen to make contact through one specific human being who they believed represented the best qualities of our species. Derek felt sick because he already knew what was coming next. The chief confirmed it and said that the Viridians had chosen Dr. Keisha Brooks to serve as Earth's primary representative and liaison to their galactic council. Derek tried to process what he was hearing, but it felt like his brain was moving through thick mud. The chief told him that the Viridians had been monitoring Earth for decades, and they had observed thousands of humans looking for someone who combined exceptional intelligence with emotional stability and compassion and resilience. They wanted someone who could remain calm and dignified, even when facing hatred and prejudice, because they knew that would be a crucial quality for representing a species as divided as humanity. The chief pulled up a video on his computer and turned the screen toward Derek. The video showed Dr. Brooks standing in a massive white room with technology that looked like nothing Derek had ever seen before. Next to her stood a being that appeared to be made of light and shifting geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. Dr. Brooks was talking with this alien being with the same calm confidence she had shown in the diner, and she seemed completely comfortable in this impossible situation. Derek watched the video and felt his entire world crumbling around him, because he understood now what he had done. He had assaulted the most important human being on the planet, and he had done it because of nothing more than the color of her skin and his own stupid assumptions. The chief closed the laptop and told Derek that the Viridians had been watching when the incident at the diner happened, and they had wanted to see how Dr. Brooks would respond to aggression and hatred, even knowing that they were observing her. The chief said that Dr. Brooks could have had Derek arrested immediately or fired, or worse, but instead she had told the Viridians that Derek was a product of a broken system and that education, not punishment, was the right path forward. Derek felt tears burning in his eyes, and he asked why she would defend him after what he did. The chief looked at Derek with something like pity and said that was exactly why the Viridians chose her, because she had the ability to see beyond immediate anger to long-term solutions. Derek left the chief's office feeling like he was walking through a nightmare, and everything around him seemed unreal and distant. He went back to his locker and changed out of his uniform because the chief had suspended him immediately pending a full investigation. The other officers in the locker room looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and disgust, because word traveled fast in a police department and everyone already knew what he had done, even if they did not know all the details yet. He drove home in his personal car and turned on the radio hoping for distraction, but every station was talking about the same thing. Earth had made contact with aliens, and Dr. Keisha Brooks was going to represent humanity to beings from other worlds. The news anchors talked about her accomplishments and her intelligence, and her grace, and Derek had to pull over because his hands were shaking so badly he could not steer. When he finally made it home to his small apartment, he turned on the television and saw Dr. Brooks everywhere. She was on every news channel being interviewed and photographed and analyzed by experts who talked about why she was the perfect choice. They showed her educational background and her research papers and her work on theoretical propulsion systems that could allow humans to travel faster than light. Derek sat on his couch and watched. This woman he had treated like garbage being celebrated as a hero, and he felt shame burning through him like acid. His phone started buzzing constantly with calls and texts from people he knew. His brother called and asked if the woman on television was the same one from the diner, and Derek could not bring himself to answer. His ex-wife sent a text saying she always knew his prejudices would catch up with him eventually. Friends from the police academy wanted to know what really happened and if the stories they were hearing were true. Derek turned off his phone and sat in silence, trying to understand how everything had fallen apart so quickly. 3 days ago, he had been a police officer with 15 years of experience and a pension waiting for him at retirement. Now he was suspended and facing possible criminal charges, and his face was about to become known to the entire world as the man who attacked Earth's representative to the aliens. The next morning, Derek woke up to find news vans parked outside his apartment building. Someone had leaked his name and address to the media, and now reporters were camped out hoping to get a statement from him, or even just a photograph. Derek peeked through his curtains and saw cameras and microphones and people waiting for him to show his face. He stayed inside with the curtains closed and the lights off. By afternoon, the story had gotten worse. Someone at the diner had provided the security camera footage to the news, and now the video of Derek throwing coffee on Dr. Brooks was playing on every channel and website. Derek watched it from his couch and saw himself from the outside for the first time. He saw how aggressive he looked and how calm she remained, and he saw the ugly smile on his face when the coffee hit her. He looked like a monster, and he realized that maybe he had been one all along. The internet exploded with anger. and people found every piece of information about him they could. His social media accounts were screenshot and analyzed for evidence of racism. Old complaints against him from his years as an officer were dug up and shared. People posted his address and his phone number, and some even posted photos of his apartment building. Protesters gathered outside with signs calling him a disgrace and demanding justice. Derek's union representative called, and her name was Karen Hughes, and she had represented officers in difficult situations before, but even she sounded worried. She told Derek that the pressure on the department to fire him was enormous, and that there was serious talk of criminal charges, including assault and possible hate crime statutes. Derek asked what he should do, and Karen said honestly that she did not know because this was unlike anything she had ever dealt with before. The story went international within 48 hours. News outlets in Europe and Asia and South America covered the incident, and foreign governments issued statements condemning Derek's actions. The United Nations released a statement calling for accountability and justice. World leaders who had been invited to meet with Dr. Brooks about the alien contact made sure to publicly distance themselves from anything Derek represented. Derek watched all of this from his darkened apartment and felt himself becoming smaller and smaller. He was no longer Derek Manning, the police officer, or Derek Manning, the person. He was becoming Derek Manning, the symbol of everything wrong with humanity. He represented prejudice and hatred and abuse of power, and now the entire world could see it, because his moment of casual cruelty had been caught on camera and broadcast everywhere. On the third day after the news broke, the President of the United States held a press conference. Derek watched it on his television with the sound turned low. The president stood at a podium with the presidential seal, and next to him stood Dr. Keisha Brooks, looking calm and professional in a dark blue suit. The president talked about this historic moment in human history and the importance of first contact with an alien civilization and the need for humanity to come together and show our best qualities to the universe. Then the president talked about Derek without saying his name directly. He talked about systemic racism and prejudice in law enforcement and the importance of accountability and change. He said that how we responded to hatred and injustice would show the Viridians what kind of species we truly were. Dr. Brooks stood silently during the speech with her hands folded in front of her, and her face showed nothing but quiet dignity. After the president finished speaking, a reporter asked Dr. Brooks directly what she thought should happen to the officer who attacked her. The room went silent, waiting for her answer. Dr. Brooks stepped up to the microphone and spoke clearly, and her voice was the same calm voice Derek remembered from the diner. She said that what happened to her was not unique, and that countless people faced similar treatment every day based on nothing more than how they looked. She said the officer was a symptom of a larger disease, and that treating the symptom would not cure the disease. She said that real change required examining the systems that allowed prejudice to flourish and taking concrete steps to reform those systems. She said she wanted accountability, but also education and growth, because punishment alone would not make anyone better. As Derek listened to her words, he realized she was still protecting him somehow, even though he deserved no protection, and that made him feel even worse. Derek turned off the television and sat in the dark, and for the first time since the incident, he let himself cry. He cried for what he had done and for who he had been and for the life that was now over. He cried because he had hurt someone who had done nothing wrong, and because he had done it so casually, like it meant nothing. He cried because he finally understood that his assumptions and prejudices had real consequences, and that those consequences could not be undone. 2 weeks after the incident, Derek received a letter that came in a plain white envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper on official United Nations letterhead, requesting his presence at a meeting. The letter gave a date and time and instructions to come alone and tell no one where he was going. It said a car would pick him up at his apartment building at 6 in the morning, and that he should bring identification but nothing else. Derek read the letter 3 times, trying to understand what it meant. His first thought was that this was some kind of trap or maybe a prank, but the letterhead looked real and the language was too formal and official to be fake. He considered ignoring it and staying in his apartment, where he had been hiding for 2 weeks, but something about the letter made him curious despite his fear. On the morning of the meeting, Derek woke before his alarm and got dressed in the only clean clothes he had left. At exactly 6 o'clock, a black vehicle pulled up outside his building, and a driver in a suit got out and came to his door. The driver checked Derek's identification and then opened the back door of the vehicle without saying a word. Derek got in and the vehicle pulled away from the curb and started driving out of the city. They drove for over an hour through suburbs and then into countryside that Derek did not recognize. The windows of the vehicle were tinted dark so he could not see much outside, and the driver remained silent the entire trip. Eventually, they turned off the main road onto a smaller road, and then onto a private drive that led to a large gate with security guards. The guards checked the vehicle and waved them through, and Derek saw that they were entering some kind of secure facility with multiple buildings, surrounded by high fences. The vehicle stopped in front of a modern building made of glass and steel. The driver got out and opened Derek's door and gestured for him to follow. They went inside, where Derek had to pass through metal detectors and have his identification checked again by more security guards. Then a woman in a business suit appeared and told Derek to follow her. She led him down a long hallway with white walls and floors that were so clean they reflected the ceiling lights. Finally, they reached a small conference room and the woman opened the door and gestured for Derek to enter. Derek stepped inside and froze because sitting at the table in the center of the room was Dr. Keisha Brooks. She was alone and she wore casual clothes and her hair was down around her shoulders. She looked up when Derek entered and her expression was neutral and calm. Derek stood in the doorway, unable to move or speak. His first instinct was to run, but his legs would not work. Dr. Brooks gestured to a chair across the table from her and told him to sit down. Her voice was the same voice from the diner and from the television interviews, and Derek felt his shame crash over him again like a wave. He managed to walk to the chair and sit down, though his hands were shaking. Dr. Brooks looked at him for a long moment, and Derek could not meet her eyes. She asked him if he knew why she had requested this meeting. Derek shook his head and his voice came out as barely a whisper when he said he had no idea. Dr. Brooks leaned forward and said that the Viridians wanted to understand him. They wanted to understand what would make a human being treat another human being the way Derek had treated her, and she wanted to understand it too. Derek finally looked up and met her eyes. He saw no anger there, but also no forgiveness, just a kind of calm curiosity that somehow felt worse than anger would have. He tried to explain himself and the words came out clumsy and inadequate. He said he was raised a certain way and that he had seen certain things growing up, and that he had made assumptions based on those experiences. He said he knew he was wrong and that he was sorry, but the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Dr. Brooks listened without interrupting, and when Derek finished, she nodded slowly. She said that what he had told her was a start, but it was not enough. She explained that the Viridians judge species not just by their best individuals, but by how the entire society responded to its worst impulses. She said that what Derek had done to her was not unique and that he had probably treated other people the same way over the years, even if the specific actions were different. Derek could not deny it because he knew it was true. He had pulled over drivers for no reason and searched people based on how they looked and assumed guilt before innocence countless times. He had never thought of himself as a bad person, but now looking back at his career, he could see the pattern of harm he had caused. Dr. Brooks told Derek that he was going to be charged with assault and that he would almost certainly lose his job and that his life as he knew it was over. Derek nodded because he had already accepted this. But then she said something that surprised him. She said she was going to give him a choice. He could accept his punishment and fade away into obscurity, or he could do something much harder. She explained that she wanted Derek to become part of a research study. He would work with psychologists and sociologists who were trying to understand how prejudice developed in people and how it could be unlearned and overcome. He would have to be completely honest about his thoughts and feelings, and his entire process would be documented and recorded. It would be humiliating and difficult and painful, but if he was capable of real change, then his transformation could become a teaching tool to help others. Derek asked her why she would give him this option after what he had done to her. Dr. Brooks sat back and was quiet for a moment before answering. She said that the Viridians had asked humanity a fundamental question about whether people could change and evolve beyond their tribal hatreds. She had told them yes, but she needed proof, and Derek could provide that proof not by being perfect, but by being honest about his imperfections and working genuinely to become better. She said that the Viridians were not interested in punishing Derek because punishment was easy and accomplished nothing. They were interested in transformation and growth because those things were hard and showed true character. She said that if Derek was willing to do this difficult work, then something good might come from a terrible situation. If he was not willing, then he would face his legal consequences and disappear from public view, and nothing would be learned from what happened. Derek sat in silence thinking about what she was offering him. Part of him wanted to refuse because the idea of having his worst thoughts and feelings examined and documented was terrifying. But another part of him recognized that this was an opportunity he did not deserve but needed. He asked Dr. Brooks if she really believed he could change, and she looked at him with those calm eyes and said she did. Not no, but she was willing to give him the chance to find out. Derek took a deep breath and said yes, he would do it. Dr. Brooks nodded and stood up and told him that someone would contact him with details about the program. She walked toward the door and then paused and turned back. She said that this process would require him to confront every ugly thing about himself, and that it would be harder than anything he had ever done. She said many people started this kind of work but gave up when it got too painful. She asked if he was sure he was ready. Derek stood and looked at her directly and said he was not sure about anything anymore, but that he owed it to everyone he had hurt to at least try. Dr. Brooks studied his face for a long moment and then nodded once and left the room. Derek stood alone in the conference room and realized that he had just agreed to tear himself apart and rebuild from nothing, and he had no idea if he was strong enough to do it. 6 months into the program, Derek was asked to speak at a conference on law enforcement reform. The conference was being held in a large hotel downtown and would be attended by hundreds of police officers from departments across the country. Derek's stomach twisted with anxiety when he received the invitation because he knew that many of these officers would hate him for what he was doing and see him as a traitor to his profession. Dr. Chen helped him prepare for the speech. She told him to focus on his own experience and not try to speak for anyone else. She reminded him that his job was not to be perfect, but to be honest about his imperfections. Derek wrote and rewrote his speech dozens of times, trying to find words that felt true without making excuses. On the day of the conference, Derek stood backstage listening to the other speakers. There were chiefs of police talking about new training programs and activists talking about community oversight and researchers presenting data on bias in policing. When it was Derek's turn, he walked out onto the stage and looked at the sea of faces in the audience. Some looked curious and some looked hostile and some looked bored. Derek stepped up to the microphone and introduced himself. He said he was not there as an expert on anything and that he was only there as a cautionary tale. He said that everything he had thought he knew about being a good police officer was wrong. There were murmurs in the audience and he saw some officers cross their arms defensively. He told them about the incident in the diner and about his years of making assumptions based on race. He told them about the body camera footage he had been forced to watch, showing his own bias in action. He told them that he had thought he was a good cop who treated everyone fairly, but the evidence showed clearly that he had not. He said his blindness to his own prejudice had hurt innocent people and damaged the community's trust in law enforcement. Some officers in the audience began to leave, and Derek watched them go. Others leaned forward in their seats listening carefully. Derek continued speaking and said that the hardest part of his transformation had been accepting that his intentions did not matter as much as his actions. He had never thought of himself as racist, but his behavior had been racist, and that was what counted. He talked about how the system had enabled his prejudices by not holding him accountable and by allowing him to justify his actions as officer safety or street experience. He said that real reform required changing the culture of policing and admitting that the way things had always been done was not good enough. He said officers needed better training and better oversight and better support for when they made mistakes. After Derek finished speaking, there was a question and answer session. A young officer asked Derek if he thought all police officers were racist. Derek said no, but that all police officers had biases whether they recognized them or not, and that those biases affected their decisions in ways they often did not realize. He said the goal was not to be perfect, but to be aware and to constantly work on improving. An older officer stood up and said angrily that Derek was making things harder for officers trying to do their jobs. He said that police work was dangerous and required quick decisions and that second-guessing every action would get officers killed. Derek nodded and said he understood that concern, but that acting on prejudice also got innocent people killed and that there had to be a balance between officer safety and community trust. The conference ended and Derek returned to the research facility feeling drained. Dr. Chen told him he had done well and that his willingness to face hostile audiences showed real growth. Professor Okonkwo said the video of Derek's speech would be used in training programs, and that several police departments had already requested copies. The work continued through the following months. Derek participated in role-playing exercises where he had to practice responding to situations without relying on assumptions about race. He read books and articles about the history of racism in America and how it had shaped institutions including law enforcement. He attended support groups with other people who were working to overcome their own prejudices. One of the most powerful experiences was when Derek met with people he had harmed during his time as an officer. The research team had tracked down several individuals who had been stopped or searched by Derek over the years, and some of them agreed to meet with him as part of a restorative justice process. These meetings were voluntary and facilitated by trained mediators, and they gave Derek a chance to hear directly how his actions had affected real people. He met a man named Charles, who Derek had pulled over 3 times in 1 year for minor violations. Charles explained how those stops had made him afraid to drive in certain neighborhoods, and how he now felt anxious every time he saw a police car. He told Derek that being stopped repeatedly for no good reason had made him feel like he was not a full citizen and that his presence was always suspicious. Derek listened and apologized, and knew his apology could not undo the damage. Charles looked at him and said he appreciated Derek's willingness to change, but that words alone were not enough. He said Derek needed to use whatever platform he had to push for real reforms that would prevent other officers from doing what Derek had done. Derek promised he would do that. He met a woman named Angela who Derek had questioned aggressively when she was walking in her own neighborhood late at night. Angela said the encounter had left her feeling violated and afraid in a place where she should have felt safe. She said Derek had treated her like a criminal when she had done nothing wrong, and that the experience had changed how she viewed police officers. Derek had no defense and no excuse, and he told her he was sorry for making her feel that way. These meetings were emotionally exhausting, but Derek forced himself to participate in all of them because he needed to understand the real impact of his behavior. He needed to see the faces of the people he had hurt and hear their stories and feel the weight of what he had done. Dr. Chen told him that this was a crucial part of the healing process, both for Derek and for the people he had harmed. As the first year of the program came to an end, Derek noticed changes in himself. He caught himself making assumptions and was able to stop and question them. He saw situations differently than he had before and recognized patterns of bias in others that he would have missed previously. He was not cured of his prejudices because Dr. Chen had explained that prejudice was something you had to actively work against for your entire life, but he was more aware and more committed to doing that work. The research team compiled their findings and published preliminary results. The data showed that intensive intervention combined with accountability and exposure to diverse perspectives could produce meaningful change in individuals who had exhibited strong prejudices. The study received significant attention from academic institutions and policymakers who were looking for evidence-based approaches to reducing bias in law enforcement. Dr. Brooks visited the research facility several times during Derek's first year in the program. She never spoke directly to Derek, but he saw her meeting with the research team and reviewing the data. Once he passed her in a hallway and they made eye contact. She gave him a small nod that might have been acknowledgement or encouragement, and then continued walking. Derek stood in the hallway after she passed, feeling grateful that she was still willing to give him a chance to prove he could change. The Viridians continued to watch and assess humanity's progress. They made it clear through Dr. Brooks that they were impressed by the research program and by Derek's participation in it. They said it showed that humans were capable of recognizing their flaws and working to overcome them, which was a necessary quality for any species that wanted to be part of the galactic community. But they also warned that one individual's transformation was not enough, and that humanity would need to show systemic change on a much larger scale. After 18 months in the program, Derek was offered a new role. Several police departments that had been following his progress wanted to hire him as a consultant to help redesign their training programs and policies. At first, Derek was hesitant because he did not feel qualified to teach anyone anything, but Dr. Chen and Professor Okonkwo encouraged him to accept. They explained that Derek's experience gave him unique insight into how prejudice operated within law enforcement culture. They said his willingness to be honest about his own failures made him credible in a way that traditional trainers were not. Officers might dismiss academics or activists, but they would have a harder time dismissing one of their own who had been through what Derek had been through. Derek accepted a position with the police department in a city 3 hours away from where he used to work. He was hired to help develop a new bias recognition and intervention training program that would be mandatory for all officers. The work was difficult and often frustrating because many officers were resistant to the idea that they needed this kind of training. In the first session Derek led, there were 30 officers sitting in folding chairs looking skeptical or hostile. Derek stood at the front of the room and told them his story without holding anything back. He described the incident at the diner and the humiliation that followed and the long, painful process of examining his own prejudices. He showed them body camera footage of his own biased stops and explained what he had been thinking in those moments. Some officers argued with him and said he was being too hard on himself and that he had just been doing his job. Derek pushed back and asked them to watch the footage carefully and identify specific moments where his decisions had been influenced by the race of the people he was dealing with. He made them uncomfortable by forcing them to see things they would rather ignore. Other officers thanked Derek privately after the sessions and admitted they recognized themselves in his story. A few said they had been making similar stops and searches for years without questioning whether they were justified. One older officer named Benjamin told Derek that watching the training had made him realize he needed to retire because he did not think he could change after so many years of doing things a certain way. Derek told Benjamin that recognizing the problem was the first step and that it was never too late to start working on being better. But he also understood that not everyone would be willing or able to do the work. Some people were too invested in their old ways of thinking and too afraid of what it would mean to admit they had been wrong. The training program that Derek helped develop became a model for other departments. It combined education about the history and psychology of prejudice with practical exercises in recognizing bias and making better decisions. It included restorative justice components where officers could meet with community members and hear directly how their actions had affected people. Most importantly, it created accountability systems so that biased behavior would be identified and addressed rather than ignored. Derek traveled to different cities giving presentations and consulting with departments that wanted to implement similar programs. He worked long hours and pushed himself hard because he felt like he had years of harm to make up for. Dr. Chen warned him about burnout and told him he needed to take care of himself, but Derek felt driven to do as much as he could while people were still willing to listen to him. During this time, Dr. Brooks's work with the Viridians continued to progress. Earth had been granted probationary status in the Galactic Council, which meant humanity could participate in discussions and receive limited technology sharing, but did not yet have full voting rights. Dr. Brooks traveled frequently between Earth and the Viridian orbital station, and she became the face of humanity's hopes for the future. The Viridians shared some of their technology with Earth, including clean energy systems and water purification methods and medical treatments for diseases that had previously been incurable, but they were careful to provide these technologies gradually and with strict guidelines because they wanted to make sure humans would use them wisely and not weaponize them or create new inequalities. Dr. Brooks explained in interviews that the Viridians were testing humanity's maturity. They wanted to see if humans could cooperate across national boundaries and share resources fairly and address climate change and poverty. She said Earth's acceptance into full membership in the Galactic Council depended on showing sustained progress in these areas. 2 years after the incident in the diner, Derek received another unexpected letter. This one invited him to attend a ceremony at the United Nations, where Earth's probationary status would be formally celebrated. Derek was surprised to be invited because he assumed he would not be welcome at such an important event, but the letter made it clear that his presence was specifically requested by Dr. Brooks herself. Derek flew to New York and checked into a modest hotel near the United Nations building. On the morning of the ceremony, he put on the only suit he owned and took a taxi to the venue. Security was intense, and Derek had to pass through multiple checkpoints showing his identification and invitation. Finally, he was directed to the main assembly hall where the ceremony would take place. The hall was filled with world leaders and diplomats and scientists and representatives. from various international organizations. Derek found his assigned seat near the back and sat down feeling completely out of place. He watched as people filed in and took their seats, and he recognized many faces from television news. Dr. Keisha Brooks entered the hall and everyone stood to applaud. She wore an elegant dress in deep blue, and she moved with quiet confidence to the stage where a podium had been set up. Behind her was a large screen showing the Viridian orbital station floating in space. Next to the podium stood a Viridian representative in physical form, which looked like a shimmering column of light that hurt to look at directly. Dr. Brooks stepped up to the podium and began to speak. Her voice was clear and strong and filled the hall easily. She talked about the journey humanity had taken since first contact, and the challenges that still lay ahead. She acknowledged that humans were a flawed species with a history of violence and inequality, but she said that humans also had enormous capacity for growth and compassion and creativity. She spoke about the need for humanity to continue working on its problems and not assume that alien technology would solve everything. She said the Viridians had made it clear that Earth's full membership in the Galactic Council would require showing sustained commitment to justice and equality and environmental stewardship. She said this was not just about impressing the aliens, but about becoming the best version of humanity that was possible. Derek listened to her words and felt both inspired and humbled. He thought about how different his life might have been if he had approached her in the diner with respect, instead of contempt. He thought about all the years he had wasted acting on prejudices instead of questioning them. He thought about the people he had hurt and the trust he had broken. After the ceremony, there was a reception in an adjacent hall. Derek considered leaving immediately, but something made him stay. He stood awkwardly near a wall watching diplomats and scientists mingle and talk. Then he saw Dr. Brooks walking toward him through the crowd. His first instinct was to panic, but she smiled slightly and gestured for him to follow her to a quieter corner of the room. They stood facing each other, and Derek struggled to find words. Dr. Brooks spoke first and said she wanted to thank him. Derek was confused and asked what she could possibly thank him for. She explained that his willingness to participate in the research program and to do the difficult work of transformation had provided crucial data that was being used to develop better training systems. She said 17 states had adopted new protocols based partly on what had been learned from his case. Derek said he did not deserve thanks for cleaning up his own mess. Dr. Brooks agreed, but said he had done it anyway, and that mattered. She said the Viridians had been watching Derek's progress as carefully as they watched hers, because they wanted to see if humans who had acted badly could genuinely change. She said Derek's transformation had been one factor in convincing them that humanity was worth investing in. Derek felt tears forming, and he blinked them away. He told Dr. Brooks that he still thought about that day in the diner constantly and wished he could take it back. She said no one could undo the past, but everyone could learn from it and use those lessons to build something better. She said that was all any person could do, whether they were representing humanity to aliens or just trying to be a better version of themselves. The program started 3 days after Derek agreed to participate. He was assigned to work with Dr. Lisa Chen, who was a psychologist specializing in prejudice and behavior modification, and Professor Howard Okonkwo, who was a sociologist studying systemic racism in institutions. They met in a facility that was part research center and part therapy clinic, and Derek quickly learned that this was going to be much harder than he had imagined. The first sessions were brutal. Dr. Chen and Professor Okonkwo did not let Derek hide behind comfortable explanations or vague statements about being raised a certain way. They pushed him to examine specific moments in his life and specific decisions he had made, and specific people he had hurt. They made him watch body camera footage from his years as a police officer, and Derek was forced to see himself through new eyes. In one video, Derek saw himself pull over a young black man for a broken taillight. He watched himself approach the car with his hand on his weapon, even though the driver was clearly unarmed and cooperative. He heard himself demand identification in a harsh tone, and saw himself search the car without real justification. The young man in the video remained calm and polite throughout the stop, but Derek could see the fear in his eyes and the tension in his shoulders. Dr. Chen asked Derek what he had been thinking during that stop. Derek tried to explain that he had been following his training and ensuring officer safety, but even as he said it, he knew it was not the full truth. Dr. Chen pushed him to go deeper and asked what he had assumed about the driver before even speaking to him. Derek struggled to articulate it but finally admitted that he had assumed the young man was probably involved in something illegal, simply because of how he looked and where he was driving. Professor Okonkwo asked Derek how many times he had made similar stops over his career. Derek thought about it and realized he could not count them all because they blurred together into a pattern of behavior that had become automatic. The professor asked how many of those stops had resulted in arrests or evidence of actual crimes. Derek admitted that very few had found anything significant. The professor nodded and said that meant Derek had harassed dozens or maybe hundreds of innocent people based solely on his prejudices. The sessions continued day after day and week after week. Derek was forced to confront every assumption he had ever made about people who did not look like him. He had to examine where those assumptions came from and how they had been reinforced over time. Dr. Chen explained that prejudice was not usually the result of one big decision, but rather thousands of small decisions and observations that built up into a worldview that felt natural even though it was fundamentally flawed. Derek learned that his father had passed down certain attitudes and beliefs without ever stating them directly. He learned that the police academy and his fellow officers had reinforced those attitudes through jokes and stories and unspoken rules about who to watch and who to trust. He learned that every time he acted on his prejudices without consequence, he was teaching himself that those prejudices were correct and justified. The hardest part was accepting responsibility. Derek wanted to blame his upbringing or his training or the system, but Dr. Chen and Professor Okonkwo would not let him hide behind those excuses. They acknowledged that all those factors played a role, but they insisted that Derek had made choices every single day about how to treat people, and those choices were his own. He could have questioned his assumptions at any point, but he had chosen not to because questioning them would have been uncomfortable and challenging. After 2 months in the program, Derek was asked if he would participate in recorded interviews that would be used for educational purposes. The interviews would be shown to other police officers and to the public and to the Viridians who were still observing humanity's response to the situation. Derek agreed because he had committed to complete honesty, even though the idea of exposing himself that way made him sick to his stomach. The first recorded interview was conducted by Professor Okonkwo, and it was filmed in a simple room with 2 chairs and a camera. The professor asked Derek to explain what he had been thinking in the moment when he threw coffee on Dr. Brooks. Derek took a deep breath and tried to put it into words. He said that when he first saw Dr. Brooks in the diner, he had felt a surge of suspicion and resentment. He could not explain exactly why, except that she was black and sitting in a neighborhood he considered his territory, and she seemed too confident and self-contained. He said that her refusal to defer to him had made him angry, because he was used to people showing respect or fear when they saw his uniform. He said the coffee had been a deliberate act meant to humiliate her and put her in what he considered her proper place. As Derek spoke these words out loud for the camera, he felt shame burning through him. He saw the ugliness of his own thoughts laid bare, and he understood how monstrous they were. Professor Okonkwo asked him what he would say to Dr. Brooks if she was watching this interview. Derek looked directly at the camera and said that he was sorry, but he knew sorry was not enough. He said he had hurt her for no reason except his own prejudice, and that he would spend the rest of his life trying to be better than the person who did. The interview was released to the public, and the response was immediate and divided. Some people praised Derek for his honesty and willingness to change. Others said he was just trying to avoid consequences and that his words meant nothing without action. Many people said he should not be given any platform at all and that his voice was taking attention away from the real victims of racism. Derek read all the criticism, and he understood where it was coming from. He released a statement saying that he was not asking for forgiveness or praise, and that he was simply documenting his process because the research team believed it might help others recognize their own biases. He said if his humiliation served a purpose, then it was the least he could do. Meanwhile, Dr. Brooks continued her work with the Viridians. She traveled to their orbital station, which was a massive structure that orbited beyond the moon and could be seen from Earth as a new bright point in the night sky. She attended meetings with beings from different worlds, and she represented humanity in discussions about technology sharing and cultural exchange, and the terms of Earth's probationary membership in the Galactic Council. The contrast between Derek's path and Dr. Brooks's path was stark and deliberate. She who had faced hatred with grace was elevated to heights no human had ever reached. He who had wielded power with cruelty was stripped of everything and forced to rebuild himself from the foundation up. The Viridians observed both paths carefully because they wanted to understand the full range of human nature. Dr. Chen explained to Derek that transformation was not a straight line. She said he would have good days and bad days and that he would sometimes fall back into old patterns of thinking. She said the important thing was to notice when that happened and correct himself and keep working. She warned him that many people started this process with good intentions, but gave up when they realized how hard it was to truly change. Derek promised her he would not give up. He said he had destroyed his own life through his prejudices, and that he owed it to everyone he had hurt to become someone different. Dr. Chen looked at him with something like cautious hope and said time would tell if he meant it. Derek knew she was right to be skeptical, because he had spent 15 years being one kind of person and it would take much longer than a few months to become another. 3 years after the incident, Derek stood in front of another group of police officers in another training room in another city. He had given this presentation dozens of times now, but he still felt nervous before each one because he never knew how the audience would respond. Some groups were receptive and eager to learn while others were defensive and hostile. Today's group seemed somewhere in between, with officers sitting with neutral expressions waiting to see what he had to say. Derek began with his usual introduction, explaining who he was and what he had done and why he was standing in front of them. He showed the diner security footage that he had watched hundreds of times, but that still made him feel sick. He talked about his years of biased policing and the harm he had caused. Then he opened the floor for questions and discussion. A young officer named Rachel raised her hand and asked how Derek knew if he had really changed or if he was just better at hiding his prejudices. It was a good question, and one that Derek had asked himself many times. He told her honestly that he did not know for certain, but that he had developed tools to check himself. He said he noticed his assumptions now and questioned them before acting. He said he sought out diverse perspectives and listened to people who had different experiences than his own. He said change was not a destination but an ongoing process that required constant attention. Another officer named Vincent asked if Derek thought all police work was racist. Derek said no, but that policing as an institution had been shaped by racism throughout American history, and that bias was built into many standard practices and policies. He said individual officers could work to overcome their personal biases, but that real change also required reforming the systems and structures that enabled discriminatory policing. After the session ended, several officers came up to talk with Derek privately. One man named George admitted that he had made stops similar to the ones Derek had described, and that watching the training had made him uncomfortable. George asked what he should do differently. Derek suggested keeping a journal of his stops and analyzing them later to look for patterns. He suggested asking himself before each interaction what assumptions he was making and whether those assumptions were based on actual evidence or just bias. Derek's work as a consultant continued to expand. He was invited to speak at universities and community forums and police academies. He worked with researchers studying bias reduction and with policymakers drafting new legislation around police accountability. The work was exhausting but meaningful, and Derek felt like he was finally contributing something positive to the world after years of causing harm. Meanwhile, Dr. Brooks's role as humanity's representative to the Galactic Council grew more complex. The Viridians introduced Earth to other member species and facilitated cultural exchanges and technology transfers. Humans began learning about alien history and philosophy and art. In return, humans shared their own music and literature and scientific discoveries with beings from other worlds. But not all of this progress was smooth. There were humans who resented the Viridians and saw their presence as a threat to human sovereignty. There were governments that wanted to militarize alien technology, despite the Viridians' clear prohibitions. There were groups that rejected the idea of alien contact entirely and claimed it was all a conspiracy. Dr. Brooks had to navigate all of these tensions while maintaining the Viridians' trust and advancing humanity's interests. Derek followed her work from a distance and marveled at her patience and skill. She dealt with far greater challenges than he faced, and she did it with grace and intelligence. He understood now that the Viridians had chosen well when they selected her to represent humanity. She embodied qualities that Derek was still working to develop in himself, including the ability to remain calm under pressure and to see past immediate conflicts to long-term solutions. 4 years after the incident, Derek was invited back to the research facility where his transformation had begun. Dr. Chen and Professor Okonkwo wanted to do a comprehensive assessment of his progress and gather data for their ongoing studies. Derek spent a week at the facility undergoing psychological evaluations and interviews and simulations designed to test his responses in stressful situations. The results showed significant change from his baseline assessments 4 years earlier. Derek demonstrated much greater awareness of his biases and much better ability to regulate his responses. He showed increased empathy and improved perspective-taking skills. But the results also showed that he still had biases and that he probably always would, because bias was a fundamental part of how human brains worked. The difference was that Derek now had tools to recognize and counteract his biases rather than acting on them automatically. Dr. Chen told Derek she was proud of his progress but warned him not to become complacent. She said the work of overcoming prejudice was never finished and that he would need to stay vigilant for the rest of his life. She said many people did well in controlled settings, but fell back into old patterns when faced with real stress or uncertainty. Derek promised her he would keep working. 5 years after the incident, the United Nations announced that Earth had been granted full membership in the Galactic Council. The announcement came after a comprehensive review of humanity's progress in addressing its social and environmental challenges. The Viridians acknowledged that Earth still had significant problems, but that the trajectory of change was positive and that humans had demonstrated genuine commitment to improving. Dr. Brooks gave a speech at the United Nations that was broadcast globally. She talked about how far humanity had come in 5 years and how far there was still to go. She said that joining the Galactic Council was not an ending but a beginning, and that the real work was just starting. She said humans would now have access to even more advanced technologies and knowledge, but that those gifts came with responsibilities to use them wisely and share them fairly. Derek watched the speech from his apartment and felt a complex mixture of emotions. He was proud of what humanity had achieved, but also aware of how much his own prejudices had nearly cost everyone. He thought about the alternate timeline where he had not thrown coffee on Dr. Brooks, but had instead treated her with basic human decency. In that timeline, maybe humanity's path would have been smoother, but Derek would not have been forced to confront his biases, and the research that came from his case would not exist. It was a strange kind of redemption, built on the wreckage of his old life. Derek had lost everything that mattered to him 5 years ago, including his career and his marriage, and his sense of identity. But in losing those things, he had been forced to examine who he really was and to build something new. The person he had become was not the person he had been, and he was still figuring out who he would be in the future. Derek's phone rang and he saw it was Dr. Chen calling. She asked if he had watched Dr. Brooks's speech, and Derek said yes. Dr. Chen told him that the research team was publishing their final report on his case, and that they wanted his permission to include his full name and story. Previous publications had used pseudonyms, but this final report would be a comprehensive analysis, and the team felt it would have more impact if Derek was identified. Derek thought about it for a moment and then agreed. He said he had committed to complete transparency from the beginning and he would not hide now. Dr. Chen thanked him and said the report would be released in 2 weeks. She warned him that there would probably be renewed media attention and that he should prepare himself for both praise and criticism. The report was released and it received significant coverage in academic journals and mainstream media. It documented Derek's transformation in detail, including his initial resistance and his gradual acceptance of responsibility, and his ongoing work to maintain the changes he had made. It included data showing that Derek's bias levels had decreased substantially over 5 years, though they had not disappeared entirely. It discussed the implications for law enforcement training and for broader efforts to reduce prejudice in society. The response was mixed, as Dr. Chen had predicted. Some people praised the research and said it showed that redemption was possible for people willing to do the work. Others criticized the focus on Derek and said too much attention was being paid to his transformation, when countless victims of police bias never got any recognition at all. Still others questioned whether any real change had occurred and suggested Derek was just performing for the cameras. Derek read all of it and tried not to let the criticism discourage him or the praise inflate his ego. He understood that he was a controversial figure, and would probably remain one for the rest of his life. He had made peace with that because the alternative was to have never confronted his prejudices at all and to have continued causing harm while believing he was a good person. On the 5-year anniversary of the incident, Derek returned to the diner where it had happened. The place looked the same with its worn booths and old counter and smell of coffee and breakfast food. Derek ordered tea instead of coffee and sat in the same booth where Dr. Brooks had been sitting that morning. He thought about how different his life would be if he had just walked past her that day, or if he had sat down and treated her with respect.